In the heart of a small town shrouded by loss and harsh winters, young Margot and her reclusive grandfather, Samuel, face tragedy when a fire threatens to sever the only connection they have left. But when a mysterious fiddler named Eli reveals an old song tied to a painful shared past, secrets begin to unravel. With music as their bridge, they piece together love, loss, and the memory of Margot's mother. Can they overcome the silence that grief has built between them? And what hidden truths will be discovered when the last note is finally played? The first gust of winter had settled over the town, weaving frost across the cracked window panes of the old house that stood at the end of a forgotten lane. Its weathered wood seemed to shiver, protesting against the cold that seeped through its splintered seams. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mothballs and burnt firewood, the quiet punctuated by the distant rattling of an old clock that hadn't kept proper time in years. "Margot, you're going to be late again," called Mrs. Boone, the sharp-voiced landlady, from the bottom of the staircase. Her footsteps creaked as she stomped back to her parlor, her scowl trailing behind like a shadow. Margot, just 8 years old, swallowed her sigh and tightened her fraying scarf. It was far too large for her slight frame, trailing down her back like a banner. It had belonged to her mother, and the faint scent of lavender clung stubbornly to its edges, a quiet reminder of warmth long lost. Margot's eyes flicked over to the small room's only companion, a grandfather who sat hunched in his armchair by the window, staring out with eyes clouded by both age and regret. His name was Samuel, though no one in the town ever called him by it. They preferred "that recluse" or "old Sam," whispered behind palms as he shuffled by on his rare trips out. His wiry hair, now completely white, jutted out like winter branches, and his hands, scarred and gnarled, clutched an empty cup. There had been a time when Samuel's presence commanded more than mutters, when he'd been the pillar that held up their tiny corner of the world. But time, that silent thief, had taken everything from him: his work, his friends, and most cruelly, his son and daughter-in-law. Now all that remained was a granddaughter he barely knew, and a house that felt as cold inside as the world outside. "Grandpa?" Margot's voice wavered in the space between them, eyes darting to the floor before daring to meet his. His stare shifted slightly, recognition a ghost flitting through his pale gaze before it settled back to the bleak gray of the window pane. "Can we light the fire tonight?" she whispered. Her fingers ached from the cold red knuckles hidden by makeshift mittens she'd sewn from the lining of an old coat. When he didn't answer, she turned, gathering her courage and the small satchel that held her school books. The silence pressed into her back as she walked out the door, her boots scuffing against the peeling wood of the steps. Outside, the sky was a wash of sullen blue, heavy with the promise of more snow. The path to the schoolhouse wound between buildings lined with narrow windows, where faces peered out, children with bright eyes and women fussing over steaming pots. The scent of bread caught on the wind, making Margot's stomach clench with longing. She tugged her scarf tighter and marched on, each step a defiance against the world's indifference. As she passed by the edge of the town square, she paused, drawn by a sight that was as peculiar as it was familiar. A busker sat with a fiddle cradled beneath his chin, bow moving as if conjuring whispers from the cold. The tune was soft, bittersweet, and it caught at the threads of Margot's heart. For a moment, it felt as if the street and the town and even the biting cold had all stilled, listening. "Shouldn't you be in school, girl?" A raspy voice snapped her back. It was Mr. Lyle, the cobbler, who watched her with eyebrows drawn like slashes above his eyes. Margot started, cheeks burning, and shuffled on. Yet the song stayed with her, a quiet hum under her breath as she turned into the narrow lane leading to the schoolhouse. The day passed in a blur of arithmetic and the low, droning voice of Miss Abernathy, but Margot's mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the silent figure at the window and the song that reminded her of stories her mother once told. When school let out, the sky was already turning the color of steel, and the first flakes of snow whispered down like fragile secrets. Margot hesitated, glancing back at the road she'd come from. If she took the longer route, it would give her time to pass the square again. Perhaps the fiddler would still be there, playing that song that seemed to stir echoes inside her. But before she could take a step, she heard the distant sound of shouts. Panic rippled through the town, voices clashing against each other. The wind carried a word that chilled her more than the cold ever could. Fire! Margot's breath quickened as she broke into a run, boots slapping against the frozen ground. The shout had come from her street, from her home. The world became a blur, but a single thought cut through her like a blade. Grandpa. Margot's feet pounded against the frozen ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps that billowed in the air like smoke. The town blurred around her, faces peering from windows, men and women spilling into the street with frantic shouts and wide eyes. The scent of burning wood clawed at her nose, sharp and suffocating, as she rounded the corner and saw it. Her house, black smoke curling up in angry tendrils from the shattered windows, flames licking hungrily at the splintered frame. "Stay back!" a man shouted as he and another rushed forward, buckets of water splashing against the porch where fire cracked and spat. Mrs. Boone stood a few paces behind, one hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes glassy with shock. The cacophony of shouts, the roar of the fire, it was all a deafening blur. "Grandpa!" Margot's voice ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. She surged forward, but a strong arm caught her mid-stride. "Not so fast, girl!" It was Mr. Lyle, the cobbler, who pulled her back with surprising strength. His face was smudged with soot, eyes narrowed with a mix of fear and stern resolve. "You can't go in there." "But he's inside. She choked on her words as the heat of the fire lashed out, stinging her face. The flames surged, reaching higher as if trying to claw at the sky, and Margot's heart thudded in her chest like a trapped bird. "He can't be," Mrs. Boone gasped from where she stood. Her voice was thin, strained. "Samuel never leaves that chair by the window." Margot's eyes darted to the window, now shattered, where smoke poured out in thick, dark plumes. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a silhouette that shifted against the glow. Hope flared painfully in her chest. "No!" she shouted, writhing in Mr. Lyle's grip. Without thinking, she bit down on his arm, enough for him to loosen his hold, just enough. She broke free and lunged toward the door, ignoring the shouts behind her, the chaos swirling around her like a storm. The doorway was an inferno, but she pressed forward, ducking beneath a beam that sagged, crackling, and spat out a shower of embers. The acrid smoke burned her eyes, forcing them shut even as she groped blindly for the familiar touch of the armchair's fabric, the rough wool that had once felt scratchy against her cheek during long winter nights. "Grandpa!" she cried, her voice muffled and swallowed by the groan of the house. Her outstretched fingers finally met something solid, skin, cold and trembling. His hand, scarred and lined with age, squeezed hers weakly. "Margot?" came the rasp of his voice, a fragile whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. He was there, bent and coughing, his eyes glistening with a look she hadn't seen before, fear. "You shouldn't have come. I couldn't leave you." Her voice cracked as she tugged at his arm, trying to lift him, but he was heavy with the weight of years and the burden of loss that had rooted him to that spot. "Go, Margot," he wheezed, pushing her with what little strength he had left. But she ignored him, tears streaming hot down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat and grime that clung to her skin. "No!" she shouted, the word tearing from her throat as she tried again, slipping her arm around his shoulders. The fire roared, furious and loud, as if mocking her determination. She stumbled, coughing as the smoke pressed in around them. For a heartbeat, she thought this was where their story would end. Two forgotten souls in an old house that no one cared enough about to save. But then, like a miracle, she felt strong hands around her waist, pulling her back. The room spun, the fire and smoke blurring into a chaotic whirl. Samuel's hand slipped from hers as she was dragged back through the door and into the biting, cold air. Voices shouted, water splashed, and suddenly she was lying on the snow-covered ground, the world spinning as she gasped for breath. "Where is he?" she screamed, trying to push herself up, but her limbs were weak and shaking. Mr. Lyle knelt beside her, his face pale beneath the streaks of soot. "We couldn't get him," he said, his voice breaking as his eyes darted to the burning house. "No! No!" The word was a broken whisper as Margot's gaze locked onto the orange glow that devoured the only place she had ever called home. Just then, the roof collapsed inward with a shuddering crash, sending a cloud of sparks spiraling into the sky like fleeting stars. The heat from the blaze was a wall between her and the house, the finality of it sinking into her bone. As the fire's roar subsided into the low, mournful crackle of dying embers, the shouts around her faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. And then, amidst the flickering chaos, a sound cut through. A familiar, mournful strain. The fiddler had returned, his music a lament, each note dripping like a tear onto the snowy street. The tune wrapped around Margot, pulling her into its sorrow as she stared at what remained of her world. The fire left a scar on the town, both literal and unseen. Blackened timbers stood as solemn reminders of the house that once was, and the scent of charred wood lingered long after the embers had died. Margot sat huddled on the cot in the small room lent to her by Mrs. Boone, staring at the wall as if it might reveal some answer in its faded wallpaper. Her fingers played absently with the fraying ends of her mother's scarf, the only possession she'd managed to save in the chaos. They said the fire was likely an accident, a spark from the old hearth, catching on some forgotten scrap. But to Margot, it felt like the world itself had turned against her, taking away the last piece of her family. Her mind replayed the image of Samuel's eyes, wide and frightened, as the smoke swallowed them. They had not recovered his body. No one spoke of it, as if acknowledging his absence might conjure the ghost of what they'd lost. "Margot, dear, you must eat." Mrs. Boone's voice interrupted the silence, softer now than Margot had ever heard it. She placed a bowl of stew on the small table by the window, the steam curling up and disappearing into the cold air that seeped through the cracks. Margot didn't move. The sounds of the town's whispers reached her even here. Poor girl. No one left? What will become of her? The words wrapped around her like chains, heavy and inescapable. She wasn't just alone. She was a puzzle missing its most important pieces. With a sigh, Mrs. Boone left the room, the click of the door shutting behind her echoing like a final note of a long song. Outside, snow fell in silent flurries, blanketing the square in a cold white that seemed to swallow sound and warmth alike. Margot's eyes drifted to the window and beyond, where she thought she caught the faintest trace of music. Her heart skipped, a painful little beat that reminded her of the day before, when the fiddler's tune had carried through the biting wind. Curiosity kindled something faint within her, a spark not entirely snuffed out. She pushed herself to her feet, wrapping the scarf tighter as she opened the door and stepped into the hall. The floor creaked beneath her, but the house was quiet. Mrs. Boone was busy in the parlor, speaking in low tones with Mr. Lyle. They wouldn't notice if she slipped out. The chill hit her as she stepped outside, making her shiver, but she ignored it, drawn by the sound that seemed to call her name. The square was empty, save for the snow that settled in a patchwork of white over rooftops and lampposts. But there, on the corner, where the cobblestones met the frozen path, was the fiddler. His head was bowed, hat pulled low, and his fingers danced over the strings with a grace that spoke of long practice. The melody was different this time, slower, tinged with longing. It made her eyes burn with unshed tears. He glanced up as she approached, dark eyes framed by a lined face that spoke of years spent in the company of hardship. He said nothing, but there was a glimmer of recognition that passed between them, fleeting but undeniable. The song faltered, a string twanging in the sudden silence. "Why do you play that song?" Margot asked, her voice barely louder than the whisper of snow falling around them. She wasn't sure what she hoped to hear. Maybe that the music carried some magic that could undo the past, or that he knew the answer to why her life had crumbled in a day. "It's an old song," he said, his voice as weathered as his hand. "One my mother used to sing when things seemed lost." Margot swallowed, the knot in her throat tightening. "Can you teach it to me?" she asked before she could think better of it. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, more a shadow of one than the real thing. He nodded, motioning for her to sit on the edge of the stone bench beside him. The fiddle was warm in contrast to the icy air as he placed it in her lap, guiding her small fingers to where they should press and hold. "It's in the song that you'll find what you're missing," he murmured, positioning her hand on the bow. "Every note has a story, girl. Yours just needs finding." The first note was rough, scraping the air with its clumsy insistence. Margot's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but the fiddler only nodded in encouragement. She tried again, letting the bow glide across the strings with more care. The sound was shaky, hesitant, but within it was a spark that made her heart thump in response. They played there for what felt like hours, the world falling away as the cold bit at her cheeks and fingers. The music became a thread, thin but resilient, weaving itself into her heart where emptiness had taken root. It wasn't until the last light of day bled into the sky that she stood, hands numb and stiff. The fiddler took back the instrument, eyes glistening with something Margot couldn't name. "Come back when you're ready," he said, his voice a quiet promise. "There's more of that song left to learn." Margot nodded, a small tremor of hope fluttering in her chest for the first time since the fire. As she turned back toward Mrs. Boone's house, the notes of the tune hummed in her head, trailing behind her like a whisper in the wind. And in that moment, she knew she would come back, not just for the song, but for the answer it seemed to hold about the threads that tied her past to the present. The days after Margot's encounter with the fiddler were marked by a subtle shift. Though the wound of the fire was fresh and deep, the melody she had learned seemed to wind through the pain, stitching small pieces of her together. Each morning she would go through her chores with Mrs. Boone's watchful eyes on her, and in the afternoons, when the snow lay thick and unyielding over the cobblestone, she would slip away to the square. The fiddler, who Margot came to know as Eli, was always there. He wore the same tattered coat and hat pulled low over his brow, his face lined with the weight of untold stories. They spoke little, but music filled the spaces between them, notes dancing in the winter air like snowflakes that never reached the ground. "Why do you play for her?" Mrs. Boone's voice startled Margot one afternoon as she returned, the last notes of Eli's song still humming in her ears. The landlady stood by the window, arms folded over her chest, eyes narrowed with something that might have been suspicion or worry. Margot's fingers tightened on her scarf. "He's teaching me." Mrs. Boone's lips thinned into a line. "Be careful with him, child. He knows more than he tells." The statement gnawed at Margot, sharp and insistent. That night, when the sky bled ink and the wind howled against the shutters, she could not sleep. Eli's music played in her mind, each note unraveling questions she didn't have answers to. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity, she slipped from her bed and down the hall, past the closed door of Mrs. Boone's room. The house creaked beneath her feet, a chorus of old voices. In the parlor, by the dim glow of a dying ember in the hearth, lay the box. It was a small, unassuming wooden chest, carved with intricate designs that she had never dared to touch before. It had belonged to her grandfather, one of the few possessions he had kept close. Now, it was the last remnant of him, hidden among the things that had been saved from the fire. With fingers trembling from cold and something more, Margot lifted the lid. Inside were faded photographs, yellowed letters tied with string, and a small folded piece of music paper. The sight of the notes inked in Samuel's careful hand made her breath catch. It was the song, Eli's song, but it was incomplete, ending abruptly in a flourish that seemed to beg for more. The door creaked behind her, and she turned sharply, heart hammering. Mrs. Boone stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, the shadows turning her face into something carved from stone. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, voice low and tight. Margot's gaze flicked to the sheet of music. "This song, Grandpa knew it. He wrote it. Why didn't he tell me?" Mrs. Boone's eyes softened for the first time, the stern lines around her mouth easing. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. "It wasn't just a song, Margot. It was a memory, one he kept hidden because it hurt too much to share." The room seemed to shrink around them, the silence broken only by the whistle of the wind outside. Margot's fingers tightened around the paper. "But why? What memory?" Mrs. Boone's shoulders sagged, as if bearing a weight she had carried for too long. Your grandfather and Eli, they knew each other once, long before you were born. That song belonged to someone they both loved and lost. Your mother, Margot. The song was hers. Margot's heart stopped. The air around her thickened as the truth unfurled slowly, painfully. The pieces fell into place. Her mother's stories, the music that always seemed to soothe Samuel when nothing else could, the way Eli watched her with eyes that held echoes of the past. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered, the question more to herself than to Mrs. Boone. "He thought he was protecting you," the older woman said, her voice gentle now. "But I think he forgot that some memories need to be shared, not buried." The room dimmed, the fire sputtering out, and they stood in the dark, two figures tied together by loss and a song that whispered of love, of moments stolen and kept. The next day, Margot returned to Eli, the folded music clutched tight in her hands. He looked up as she approached, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips when he saw the paper. "So, you found it," he said, nodding as if he had known she would. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margot asked, the question trembling in the air between them. Eli's eyes, dark and deep as the forest at night, looked into hers with a sadness that spoke of years lost. "Your mother was the thread that tied us all together. When she was gone, your grandfather and I, we both broke. But seeing you, hearing the song again, it brought pieces of her back." Margot held out the paper, and Eli took it, smoothing it out with care. "Finish it with me," she said, the words more command than request. For the first time, Eli's smile reached his eyes. "Let's finish it, Margot, for her." And so, they began again, the music threading through the cold, winding around them both, drawing the past into the present. Each note was a step toward understanding, toward piecing together a story that had waited too long to be told. The first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, painting the snow in hues of soft gold and pale blue. Margot sat on the edge of the stone bench in the square, watching her breath fog the air as she waited for Eli. The folded sheet of music was tucked carefully into her pocket, its presence a reminder of the truths she was now determined to understand. Eli arrived with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked the same streets 1,000 times. His hat, now battered beyond recognition, cast a shadow over his eyes. He nodded at her, setting down his fiddle case before speaking. "Are you sure about this, Margot?" His voice was rough, a blend of concern and something deeper, fear, perhaps. It was the first time she'd heard it, and it unsettled her. "Yes," she said firmly, though the tremor in her fingers belied her certainty. "I need to know." They began to play, each note resonating in the crisp morning air. The song felt different now, fuller, richer, like it carried not just memories but voices. People paused in the square, drawn by the haunting melody that wound its way around them. Margot's fingers stumbled only once, but Eli's nod steadied her. Together, they played until the end, where the music faded on a note so tender it could have been mistaken for a sigh. When the final sound died away, the silence was almost sacred. It was Eli who broke it, his voice low and rough. "There's more to tell, Margot, more than music can show." "Then tell me," she urged, her heart thudding in her chest. "Tell me about her." Eli exhaled, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the square, lost in time. "Your mother Lillian was the brightest thing in Samuel's life. In mine too," he added, the words tinged with the kind of pain that never fades. "She was the one who brought us together, with her laughter and that song. She played it better than either of us ever could." Margot listened, each word cutting into the wall of silence her grandfather had built around their shared past. Eli continued, voice wavering as he spoke of days filled with music, of a love that had thrived and shattered when tragedy struck, a storm, an accident that swept Lillian away and left them drowning in grief. "She was carrying you when it happened," Eli said, looking at Margot with eyes that glistened. "Samuel couldn't bear it. He blamed himself for not being there, for not saving her. I tried to reach him to pull him back, but he shut me out. The song was all we had left, and even that he couldn't face." Margot's chest ached, the weight of understanding pressing down like a heavy hand. the silence that Samuel had wrapped himself in, the reason he never spoke of her mother, of Eli. It all made sense now. He had been protecting himself from a pain so vast it left no room for anything else. "I wish I'd known him better," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks, unchecked. The sting of them in the cold air made her shiver, but she didn't wipe them away. They were a tribute to the woman she'd never truly known, to the men who had loved her and lost her. Eli reached out, a hesitant, almost trembling hand that rested briefly on her shoulder. "You know him now, Margot, and that's what matters." A sudden sound interrupted them, a gasp, sharp and surprised. Margot turned to see Mrs. Boone standing at the edge of the square, her face pale, eyes wide. "Samuel, she stammered, gesturing wildly. "They found him." Margot's heart stopped, then lurched into a gallop as she bolted toward Mrs. Boone, Eli on her heels. The woman grabbed her arm as if to steady herself. "It was in the woods beyond the old mill. He's alive, Margot." Alive. The word echoed through her mind, filling every corner with hope so fierce it left her dizzy. The path to the mill was narrow and lined with skeletal trees that reached out with brittle fingers. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they followed the hurried path of men who had gone before. The world was a blur, each step pounding with the rhythm of her heart. Finally, they reached a clearing where townsfolk gathered, murmurs buzzing like bees, and there, wrapped in blankets and propped against the bark of an old oak, sat Samuel. He looked older, smaller somehow, his skin pale beneath the dusting of soot that still clung to his clothes. His eyes, once clouded, met Margot's as she pushed through the crowd. They widened, a flicker of something, recognition, disbelief, relief, all at once. "Grandpa!" Margot's voice broke, and she fell to her knees beside him. His hand, thin and cold, reached out and brushed her hair back, the movement shaky but gentle. "Margot," he whispered, as if tasting the name for the first time in years. His eyes glistened, and a tear traced a line through the grime on his cheek. "I thought I'd lost you." The world around them fell away. The murmurs of the crowd, the chill of the snow, all of it vanished as she leaned into him, feeling the frail, warm weight of his arms around her. The past no longer pressed like a blade against them, but settled, a memory shared and understood. Eli stood at the edge of the clearing, the fiddle in his hand, watching as the last piece of their story clicked into place. He lifted the instrument, and the first notes of Lillian's song drifted through the clearing, soft and full of longing. Samuel's eyes closed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And as the song filled the space between them, Margot knew they had found not just the man, but the parts of themselves that had been lost along the way. The clearing was silent except for the soft strains of Eli's fiddle. The song reached out, binding the moment in a delicate thread of memory and hope. Samuel's hand trembled against Margot's as he leaned back against the oak, eyes fluttering shut as if lost in the music that once filled the rooms of their old house. Margot couldn't look away, watching the years peel back from his weathered face as something like peace settled over him. When the song ended, the crowd that had gathered exchanged glances, uncertain what to do with the emotions that hung thick in the air. Mrs. Boone stepped forward, clearing her throat and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she pretended not to need. "Come on, everyone," she called, her voice a bit firmer now. "Let's give them space." Slowly, the townsfolk dispersed, footsteps crunching through the snow as they returned to their lives, changed somehow by what they had witnessed. Eli lowered the fiddle, eyes meeting Margot's with a silent question. She nodded, a small gesture that spoke of gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared loss and rediscovery. Margot turned back to Samuel, who opened his eyes with a faint smile. They were still tired, still shadowed by pain, but there was a glimmer there that hadn't been before, a spark of life. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, voice hoarse from the smoke and cold. "But I'm glad you did." Tears pricked Margot's eyes as she clutched his hand tighter. "I had to. I couldn't lose you, too." Samuel's gaze softened, and he drew in a slow, shaky breath. "There's so much I never told you," he said, the words trailing off as his head rested against the tree. "About your mother, about why I kept silent for so long." Eli stepped closer, setting the fiddle down on the snow-covered ground. "You don't have to explain, Samuel," he said, his voice low but steady. "We all buried parts of her, each in our own way. But now it's time we remember." The old man's eyes, dulled by years of regret, turned to Eli with a look that spoke of both apology and recognition. "You were right to try back then," Samuel admitted, the confession hanging heavy between them. "I just didn't know how to listen." Silence fell over them, deep and thoughtful, broken only by the rustle of branches as a breeze swept through the clearing. Margot shifted, her heart beating hard in her chest as she spoke. "I want to know her," she said, voice wavering. "Not just the pieces I remember, but all of her." Samuel's expression softened with a mix of sorrow and love. He nodded slowly, reaching a hand toward the pocket of his coat. With trembling fingers, he pulled out a small, time-worn locket, its silver tarnished and scratched. He placed it in Margot's palm, the metal cool and delicate. "This was hers," he whispered, eyes shining. "It holds a picture, taken on the day she played that song for the last time." Margot opened the locket, the hinges creaking softly. Inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a woman with a smile so wide it seemed to light up the small oval frame. Lillian's eyes, alive with joy, looked just like Margot's own. Her fingers traced the edges, the image blurring as tears filled her eyes. "She would have loved you to play," Samuel said, a smile breaking through the sorrow on his face. "And she would have loved that you have Eli to teach you. She always said he was the only one who could make the fiddle sing." Eli's eyes glistened, and he cleared his throat, looking away for a moment to compose himself. When he turned back, his voice was steady. "I think it's time we teach Margot more than just the song. It's time she knows the stories behind it, all of them." Samuel nodded, his grip on Margot's hand tightening with renewed strength. "Yes, it's time." The wind seemed to echo their resolve, a faint whisper through the clearing. Together, they made their way back toward the town, Samuel leaning on Margot and Eli as the light of the morning brightened. The locket warmed in her palm, a talisman of the past guiding them forward. And in the space between grief and hope, Margot felt something settle within her, a promise that they would honor her mother not just with silence, but with stories and song. That night, as they gathered around the small fire in Mrs. Boone's parlor, Samuel's voice filled the room with stories long kept hidden. He spoke of Lillian's fierce laugh, her stubborn heart, and the way she would dance barefoot across the old wooden floors. Eli played the fiddle, each note weaving through Samuel's words like a thread, binding them together. For the first time, Margot didn't feel alone. She felt connected, not just to the memory of her mother, but to the men who had loved her and lost her and found her again in Margot's determined eyes. And as the fire crackled and the music swelled, Margot knew that this was only the beginning. The song would carry them forward, binding the past and present in a way that only love could. Winter's tight grasp began to loosen, and the snow that once blanketed the town melted into rivulets that trickled through the cobblestones, whispering of spring. The cold had taken much from Margot and Samuel, but it had also given them something back, a sense of connection, woven tightly by music and shared stories. It wasn't just the song anymore. It was the life that surrounded it, the laughter, the tears, and the memories that rose like new shoots from the frozen ground. Samuel's health, fragile as it was, began to mend under the careful watch of Mrs. Boone and the comforting presence of Margot and Eli. The old man had moved into a room on the first floor of the boarding house where the scent of stew and bread baking in the kitchen seemed to breathe life back into him. Margot spent her days learning the songs Eli had promised, not just playing the notes, but understanding the stories embedded in each phrase. They were lessons in love, loss, and resilience. One afternoon, as the first blooms peeked through patches of thawed earth, Samuel called for Margot from his chair by the window. His voice was stronger now, carrying a warmth that had been absent for years. "Come here, Margot," he said, gesturing with a hand that no longer shook as it once did. She came to his side, setting her fiddle down carefully on the small table by the window. The sunlight caught the locket around her neck, making it glisten like a star caught in the daylight. "Do you remember what I said that day in the clearing?" he asked, his eyes, lined but kind, watching her closely. Margot nodded, the memory of his words still vivid. "You said you thought you'd lost me." Samuel's gaze drifted out the window to where the square lay bustling with life, a stark contrast to the silence of winter. "I did think that. For so long I thought I'd lost everything, but I didn't lose you, Margot. And for that, I'm grateful." His voice wavered on the last word, and Margot felt the familiar prickle of tears. She swallowed hard and placed her hand over his. "You didn't lose me, Grandpa. And we didn't lose her either, not really." Samuel's eyes shone with unshed tears, and a slow, tender smile spread across his face. "No, we didn't." Eli's voice called from the hallway, breaking the quiet moment. "Are you two ready? The town's waiting." The town had gathered at the old meeting hall, curious about the music they had heard drifting from the square over the past weeks. It was Samuel who had suggested the idea, a performance that would not just be music, but a story shared, a way to honor Lillian. It had taken time to convince Margot, but now, standing at her grandfather's side, she felt ready. They walked together, Samuel leaning on her arm, Eli beside them with his fiddle in hand. The hall was warm, lit by lanterns that swayed slightly in the evening breeze. Faces turned as they entered. Familiar ones that had been shadowed by sympathy and whispers were now lit with anticipation. Margot took her place on the small stage, heart thundering as Eli settled next to her and nodded, his eyes full of pride. Samuel sat close, his presence a steady reassurance. As she drew the bow across the strings, the first notes filled the room, trembling with both uncertainty and hope. Eli joined her, their music winding together, strong and sure. The song was the same one that had carried them through the worst of winter, but it was more now. It was layered with memory, with loss and love stitched into each note. The hall was silent, the air vibrating with the sound that resonated in each heart present. When the last note faded, the quiet was broken by a single clap that grew into a wave of applause, warm and embracing. Samuel's eyes were closed, his head tipped back, a smile touching his lips. The room erupted, but for Margot the sound was secondary to the feeling that filled her, the knowledge that she was part of something greater, something that had survived the harshest of seasons and come through stronger. As people came up to speak, to tell stories of Lillian or offer praise, Eli leaned close. "You did her proud, Margot," he said, voice thick with emotion. Margot glanced at Samuel, who watched her with eyes so full of pride and love that she felt a lump in her throat. "We all did," she whispered, squeezing Eli's hand. The crowd eventually thinned, voices fading into the night as lanterns were dimmed. The three of them lingered in the warmth of the hall, the glow of candles casting long shadows that seemed more like echoes of the past than anything frightening. Samuel reached for Margot's hand, his fingers warm and strong. "Thank you, Margot," he said, voice a soft rumble, "for bringing me back." Margot looked at Eli, then back at Samuel, and nodded. "We brought each other back." They sat there for a while longer, the quiet comfortable and filled with unspoken words. And as the final candle flickered and the stars winked through the windows, Margot felt the music still humming in her bones, a promise that would carry them all forward. The following morning dawned bright and warm, a soft breeze carrying the scent of fresh blooms and the distant chirping of birds. It was as if the world itself had decided to celebrate the renewal that had taken place in the small town. Margot sat on the front steps of Mrs. Boone's boarding house, the locket in her hand catching the morning sun. She traced its edges with her thumb, a quiet smile playing at her lips. Samuel's room was filled with the soft light of day, and he sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the life bustling on the street below. His face, no longer as shadowed by the past, seemed softer, his eyes following children who darted past in a blur of laughter. Eli arrived with his fiddle tucked beneath his arm, a knowing nod exchanged between him and Samuel. "Ready, old friend?" Eli asked, a playful challenge in his voice. Samuel chuckled, the sound low and warm. "It's been years since these hands did more than hold a cup of tea, but let's see what's left." Margot's eyes widened in surprise as Samuel shifted forward, his hands stretching toward the small harmonica that sat on the table beside him. It had belonged to him since he was a boy, its metal tarnished but gleaming in the sunlight. He lifted it with a touch of reverence, turning it over in his palms before glancing up at Eli and Margot. "This was the first way I ever learned to speak without words," Samuel said, his eyes misting with memory. "And now, I'd like to speak again." The three moved to the square, now vibrant with people who lingered after the previous night's performance, sharing stories and laughter. A murmur passed through the crowd as Samuel sat down, Eli and Margot flanking him. The square seemed to hold its breath as Samuel raised the harmonica to his lips. The first note was thin, a tremulous echo of the past, but as he played, it grew steadier, richer. The melody wrapped around the notes Eli coaxed from his fiddle, and Margot joined with her own, the bow sliding over strings with a newfound confidence. The song was different this time, not just Lillian's but theirs, a woven testament to the resilience that bound them. The people in the square listened, some with tears glistening in their eyes, others with smiles that spoke of shared memories. Mrs. Boone stood at the back, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Mr. Lyle paused, leaning on his cane as he watched the trio. The song ended in a soft, harmonious chord that seemed to hang in the air long after they'd finished playing. Samuel lowered the harmonica, his eyes wet with unshed tears as he looked at Margot. "I didn't know music could feel like this again," he whispered, the words almost lost in the breeze. Margot leaned over, pressing a kiss to his temple. "It was always here, Grandpa. We just had to find it together." The crowd erupted into applause, but it was the quiet moments that followed that held the most meaning. People approached with kind words, laughter, and stories about Lillian, memories Samuel had once thought too painful to bear, but now received with a soft smile and nod. As the day wore on and the square slowly emptied, Margot, Eli, and Samuel sat together in the warmth of the sun, the harmonica and fiddle resting between them. The locket around Margot's neck glimmered, a promise fulfilled and carried forward. Margot looked at Samuel, who seemed content and at peace for the first time in years. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" she asked, voice soft. Samuel's smile widened, deepening the lines on his face in a way that spoke of both grief and joy. "She'd be more than proud, Margot. She'd be here, playing with us, telling us to keep up." They laughed, the sound easy and full, ringing through the square like music itself. Eli picked up his fiddle and played a few playful notes, and Margot joined in, their laughter folding into the melody that carried through the town. And as the last light of day began to fade into a warm, dusky blue, Margot felt the weight of loss and love balanced in her heart. The song had changed them all, drawn them out of the cold and into the light, where they belong. It would live on, not just in the notes and chords they played, but in the stories they told, the hands they held, and the laughter that would always be part of them. The music ended, but the echoes of it remained, lingering in the space between heartbeats, a reminder that even in the hardest winters, warmth could always be found again. Thank you for following Margot, Samuel, and Eli on their journey through loss, music, and rediscovery. If you enjoyed their story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales of resilience and hope. Share this story with friends or click on the next one to continue exploring the power of connection.